Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Very Close Encounters with Humanoids, 10 Shocking True Cases. I've got some really amazing cases for you today, stretching all the way back to 1923 and up to 2012. And these cases, of course, come from all over the world. I've got cases from France, Italy, Spain, Russia, the Caribbean, Argentina and Brazil, and 3 cases from the United States. And as always, a wide variety of humanoids. Short little guys, quite tall ETs, human-looking ETs, strange humanoids of all kinds, really. And, of course, supported by some really amazing evidence. In these cases, some involve photographic evidence, radar returns, landing traces, and more. So really undeniable evidence. And these are the kinds of cases I think that do have something new to offer in terms of our understanding of extraterrestrial contact. And I think they're just darn fascinating. So I do have a lot of cases to cover today. Let's get started. First case I want to talk about today, I call a UFO Lands for Repairs. I like this case because it occurred very early in terms of UFO history. June of 1923, it occurred in Mount Erie, Illinois. And yeah, it's a very early case, and one of very few in which people report that a UFO is apparently landing for repairs. It's also very interesting because of the type of ET described, and the witness himself is quite credible. The witness in this case is Norman Wilson Massie. And a good witness, as I said. He grew up to be a teacher, a basketball coach, a school principal. His encounter did occur way back on a warm summer morning in June of 1923 when he was only 10 years old. And I'll just let Norman describe in his own words what happened. As he says, "I opened the gate to let the horses into the pasture. I looked back down the field, and there was an object with lights all around it. I kept walking closer to the object until I got about 50 feet away. I stood there and watched the 5 men who were on board. The machine was metallic and stood on 3 legs. The top was a dome with holes in it. The best way I could describe the top was it looked like melted glass. I got close enough that I could hear them talk. One guy sat in a chair, and the others called him the commander. 4 others made trips back and forth in the ship. I didn't know what was going on until the end. Then one of the crew members told him that the repairs had been made." So Norman watched all of this for about 5 minutes. The beings, he said, had blonde hair and were no more than 4 feet tall, but looked pretty much human. Then, without warning, the craft rose up, the 3 landing legs telescoped back into the bottom section of the craft, which rose vertically about 200 feet, and then accelerated away as fast as a bullet to the west. Now Norman immediately ran inside and told his parents, Grover and Laura, and his brother Floyd Lavier what had happened, and they were all skeptical. They thought initially he was making up the whole thing. And as Norman says, "Mom and Dad tried to convince me that I really hadn't seen anything and was making up the whole thing." Now his dad said not to tell anybody anything as they might think Norman was, quote, "crazy in the head or an idiot." So Norman listened to his parents and ended up keeping this encounter secret for most of his life. But decades later, in 1990, now in his 70s, he found the courage to share his encounter with his son Jerry, who was actually a colonel in the Air Force at the time. And his son was surprisingly not at all surprised. As Norman says, "When I got done telling him the whole story, he told me that there was nothing wrong with me, that the Air Force files are full of pictures of UFOs. He accepted the story as the truth. It doesn't bother me one bit that people might think I'm a crazy old man. In my own mind and my own heart, it existed, and I saw it with my own 2 eyes." Certainly a very unusual case. And yeah, when the witness is a teacher, a school principal, he's very well respected. He kept his experience secret for so many years. I find his testimony quite compelling. And the fact that it occurred so early, 1923. If this were a later case, I might be persuaded to think that this could be a reverse engineered case. But way back in 1923, I don't know. And the fact that these ETs are described as 3 foot, 4 foot tall humanoids certainly doesn't sound like normal people. It's a really amazing and unusual case. And now we move to another one that's equally unusual and also quite early. This one I call Many Surprises Await Terrestrials. And this case occurred in the summer of 1945 in Tagarog Bay. This is in the Sea of Azov in Russia. Don't hear a lot of cases coming out of this area, but there are tons of them. This is a single witness case, like the previous one, but very unusual. I like it because the witness had quite an interesting interaction with this alleged ET. The researcher of this very unusual and early case is Alexei K. Premia. He's the author of UFO Witnesses to the Unknown. And this case was also presented by Albert Rosales in his book, Humanoid Encounters. Again, it is a single witness case by a 9-year-old boy known only as I. Chibotarov. It was a summer day in 1945, and the witness was fishing for his family in the Tagarog Bay. This is located on the east side of the Sea of Azov in the Rostov area of Russia. He had filled his bucket with fresh fish after fishing for a while and was about to return home when suddenly, he says, an object that looked kind of like a, quote, giant plate descended from the sky and dove into the water with such speed and force that the witness was actually soaked by the water. He said this object was 15 feet wide, composed of shiny metal, and it came to rest on a sandbar several feet offshore away from the witness. Immediately, a series of bubbles emerged from the water surrounding the craft, and suddenly a, quote, man came out of the disk, jumping from out of the top, and he immediately began to approach the very surprised witness to a distance of about 20 feet. The witness had no fear. He said that this figure was dressed in a silvery overall. He wore a dark helmet which covered his head completely. On his back he wore a can-shaped object which looked kind of like tinted glass. He also had a small sack hanging from his chest area and was holding what looked like a blue stone in one of his hands. So the two of them stood there looking at each other in complete silence for about a full 3 minutes. So curious, the witness finally asked the being, speaking in Russian, "Do you come from the moon?" The being paused for a long moment, then replied, also in perfect Russian, "No, I am from another planet." So the witness then asked, "What is the name of your planet?" There was another long pause, and the ET apparently ignored this question and said instead, "Many surprises await terrestrials, and they will be happy for them." So the boy continued to ask questions, and he said, "Please tell me about your planet." And the ET pointed to the disk in the water and said, "If you want, come into my ship, and soon you will be in my planet." So the witness considered this offer, but then he thought of his family and became concerned about what would happen if he didn't return. So he told the ET, "I do not want to fly with you, and I want to go home. My mother waits for me there." He pointed to his bucket of fresh fish and said, "We are going to eat fried fish for dinner." And the being's response was, "It's a pity that you do not want to come." And then he turned around and walked back to the craft. At this point, the witness did notice that this being was actually barefoot, had long feet with long toes that looked pretty much human-like. But before entering the craft, the being did have one more message for the witness, informing him that the witness could tell people about the encounter, but that nobody would believe him. He then climbed back into the craft, which rose briefly, then re-entered the water. The witness took his bucket and went home, and of course later spoke with researchers, and that's how we found out about this case. That case definitely does have some unique elements, and yeah, the witness was a child, and this occurred quite some time ago, and there's no real physical evidence to support it. It's purely anecdotal, but apparently was investigated by a researcher, and you can make up your own minds about it, but it definitely fits the pattern we see in so many other cases. It's a shame that the witness did not take the invitation to go on board the craft. This might have been a very different story, but certainly, I think, an important contribution to the UFO field. And now we move to the next case, which is by far my favorite in this compilation, a really important case. You may have heard of it, probably haven't heard the whole story though. I call this one, Humanoids Visit a Navy Ship. And this actually occurred over a period of many years, but the main incident occurred in October of 1958 in the Caribbean Sea. This is not far away from Cuba. It's a really compelling case involving photographic evidence, many witnesses, radar returns, and it deserves to be far more well known than it is. This case has been investigated by John Bowman, who wrote about it, but primarily the investigation is done by the witness himself. He is a Navy officer by the name of Chester Gruzinski, who was assigned aboard the USS aircraft carrier Franklin D. Roosevelt, which, by the way, and this could be important, was the first carrier to hold nuclear weapons. This is a large ship. It had a crew of about 3,000 people. But, as it turns out, it's also a major UFO magnet, with a total of at least 8 or 10 UFO encounters. The first that's known about took place in 1952 after the FDR left Portsmouth. The witness was an electronics technician by the name of John S. Lawrence, who says, and I quote, "One night I was in my bunk reading when my compartment buddies, who were outside, called for me to come out quick. They pointed an object out to me that was in the sky. It looked like a very bright star that moved in an erratic pattern, accelerating very rapidly. It would stop for a short period of time and again accelerate very rapidly and again stop. We followed the object across the sky with this same start-stop action, and not in a straight line, until we lost it in the light of the moon, which was just starting to come up. To this day, I am not sure what we saw." Now, of course, he was not the only witness. Reportedly, many photos were taken by a journalist who was on the deck at the time. Another sighting took place when the ship was off Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. This was on July 26, 1956, when, as Chester Gruzinski says, 2 disc objects were suspended in midair. They were over one another. They had 2 rows of counter-rotating lights. The upper disc released a fireball object that dropped into the top of the lower. Now, the main witness in this case was Petty Officer 3rd Class Leon Treadwell, who says that he was actually forced to sign a 20-year-long non-disclosure agreement. And I'll just quote Leon Treadwell directly because he describes his experience in detail. As he says, "These objects were seen by me as well as several dozen others, including officers, while crew members of the carrier Franklin D. Roosevelt. The time was in the early morning hours of July 26, 1956, while at anchor in the port of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Most of the crew were asleep and unaware of the sightings. As members of CIC Radar Division, these objects were watched through high-power binoculars for several minutes before they finally vanished with tremendous speed. When first sighted, the objects were suspended in midair over one another with 700 feet between them. A radar fix placed them several miles from the FDR's position at a height of about 2,000 feet. 2 rows of bright counter-rotating lights could be seen through the middle of each object that made them appear to be round in shape. For several minutes, they never moved. Then the upper one released a fireball object that dropped into the top of the lower one. Within seconds, they both vanished with tremendous speed. Radar contact was almost impossible. It was estimated the objects could have been between 75 and 100 feet in length. All involved were told to keep a tight lip on what we saw. A report was filed, signed, and sent to the Defense Department, along with a color sketch by me of what was watched that night by many. And there were more cases. 1 month later, around July 25 to 27, 1956, Chief Warrant Officer John C. Howe witnessed what he described as a cigar-shaped object, which was not only visually seen, but tracked on radar. And again, I'll just quote the witness directly, as John says in his own words. As I recall, the signal bridge was called by Combat Information Center asking for visual verification of an air search radar contact in our vicinity, holding stationary. Inspection revealed a cigar-shaped object, estimated to be at 5,000 feet, close by the zenith. It was displaying at least one row of white lights. I do not remember if any were flashing. After about 10 or 15 minutes, it suddenly started moving in a northerly direction, accelerating smoothly and rapidly until it disappeared from view in 1 or 2 minutes. It may have disappeared more quickly than that, as CIC later said it went off their radar scope in 2 or 3 sweeps. The incident was reported to the officer of the deck, and I am sure to the commanding officer, Captain John T. Hayward. The sighting was certainly noteworthy enough to have been logged both in the CIC Watch Officer's log and the Smooth Deck log. Copies of the latter would be available from the Ship's Histories Branch, Naval Historical Center in Washington Navy Yard, Washington, D.C. Here's where it gets interesting, because a later examination of the ship's logs showed that both of these events had been removed or blacked out. Now, perhaps the most interesting encounter of all on the Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the sighting by Chester Gruzinski. He was only 18 years old at the time and serving as a fireman's apprentice. The ship was in the Caribbean near Cuba. It was about 10 p.m. one evening in 1958, and this is when Chester first noticed something was out of the ordinary. He was below decks, and suddenly a number of seamen started hurrying up to the flight deck. As Chester says, I was down below when I was told to go topside to see something strange. So I went up, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I saw a bright white ball of light. There was a small light that was following our ship. It headed straight for us, getting bigger and brighter. The light came right at us. It was spherical, approximately 75 to 100 feet long. It turned red-orange, and I could feel the heat on my face. Now, at this point, all the ship's maneuvers immediately stopped dead. Chester could see at least 25 other officers also watching this object, which was now moving in a sort of wobbling fashion. You could see now that it was actually sort of cylindrical shaped or cigar shaped. He said it moved directly towards the ship, only stopping when it was a few hundred feet away. And now he could clearly see a row of squarish windows, each glowing with an orange light. As this was occurring, the man on the bridge watch was yelling into the intercom for the deck officer to get up on deck on the double. Meanwhile, Chester was amazed to see what looked like humanoid figures of some kind looking down at him from this row of square portholes lining the circumference of the craft. As Chester says, it came in close enough to us so you could see the shape of the object and also see that there were figures inside it. I could see silhouettes of figures looking at us. They had no features, but you could tell they weren't human. The impression I got was that those figures were not human. I was kind of shocked because I wasn't expecting something like that. Then the bottom turned cherry red and it vanished in a flash. So per Chester, one of these beings was sort of leaning against the glass and appeared to be looking down at the witnesses, while the other could only be seen from the neck up. But before this object left, both of these figures appeared to move away from the windows, and the whole incident lasted only about 2 to 5 minutes. But things weren't over yet. The next day, Chester says he felt strangely dehydrated, had to drink a lot of water. The first thing he did was check the ship's, quote, plan of the day. This is a news sheet. And he was looking to see if there was any mention of the incident. Not surprisingly, there wasn't anything. A few officers asked him about it, but he decided to deny the incident. He asked other people, they didn't know anything. But it turned out his decision to deny the incident turned out to be a pretty wise decision. Because Chester says that shortly after this encounter, any crew members who had talked about the incident were transferred. The CIA came on board to investigate a so-called, quote, gambling problem. This is apparently a cover-up because, as Chester says, it was a massive cover-up. There was no gambling. Now, it's even weirder because several months later in 1960, Chester, still on duty, he accidentally cut his finger and had to go under anesthesia to have it stitched up. And he says that as he was coming out of anesthesia, a doctor was actually questioning him about the incident. He's not sure exactly what he said in response. But later, while recovering, he was asked more questions about this sighting, but he denied seeing anything. Now there was more encounters. In 1963, another major sighting occurred. Radar officer Harry A. Jordan, who you can see here, was a witness. He was interviewed directly by Chester Gruzinski. And in fact, in 1998, Harry Jordan spoke before the U.S. Senate's UFO hearing. He stated that after a UFO was detected on radar, Phantom F-4Bs were launched in an attempt to intercept it. A 20-minute-long chase ensued. Finally, the jets returned to the ship. At the time, they had actually chased this apparent craft about 600 miles away. And then they landed back on the FDR, and in a matter of about 1 second, the UFO darted back and flew right over the ship. So here is a little quote from Harry Jordan. As he says, "I detected a very large UFO during my mid-watch on radar off the coast of Sardinia in late '63. I provided the Senate Intelligence Committee with an affidavit detailing my experience. During this particular cruise, there were several photographers on board to document the NATO fleet operations. They were present on board the night of my contact on radar. I was told in no uncertain terms to keep my mouth shut for 20 years. But what I experienced that night will never be forgotten." So the FDR was eventually decommissioned in 1977, and 1 year later in 1978 was sold for scrap metal. But Chester Gruzinski could never forget what happened to him. Years later, he decided to step forward publicly with his sighting, and he began to talk to other former crew members, and soon learned that the ship had experienced multiple visitations by UFOs. He single-handedly opened up a huge can of worms and discovered that there was in fact a cover-up of UFO events that have taken place on the FDR. He interviewed many of the other witnesses, got written statements and letters from them describing these many encounters. And it was he who found out that the ship's logs had been purged of any information regarding these cases. He did file requests with the Freedom of Information Act. All of these proved fruitless. As Chester says, the Freedom of Information Act requests to the Navy Department, the CIA, and the NSA did not produce any information. Why all of those sightings from one Navy ship? The USS FDR was the first Navy aircraft carrier that was allowed to carry nuclear weapons. And this was including the H-bomb. So I think that's a significant factor here. We do know UFOs are very much attracted to anything involving nuclear material in any capacity. They're very concerned about this. We know this from first-hand contactee reports. So Chester worked hard to publicize this story, and it did get quite a bit of attention. It was featured in UFO magazine, later on the TV program Sightings. But even today, he's still searching for information about this and is still suffering backlash from coming forward. As he says, I get teased about this all the time. But this whole series of events continues to be covered up. And as Chester says, I just want the truth to be known. In fact, he's currently working on a screenplay about all of this called Out of the Sky. Man, oh man, that case, that series of events is so important. And I think really cements the fact that ETs are very concerned about our use of nuclear weapons. I think that's probably why this ship was visited so many times. I really feel for the witnesses, especially Chester Grusinski. If not for him, we probably wouldn't even know about these events. And yet he's been able to gather together many witness testimonies. So it's an undeniable event with radar returns, photographs, some of these witnesses testifying before Congress. It's really incredible, and I'm surprised it's not more well known. It honestly should be front page news. And it's not, and we can blame our own governments for that fact. This cover-up has had a devastating effect on the progress of ufology, and it simply can't go on. It's why I do this research. The subject is very important, and everyone deserves to know the truth about what's going on here. So yeah, a really amazing case, and I bet there are many, many more like it. And now we move to another case, which is not very well known, but certainly deserves to be. I call this one The Doctor and the Alien. And what a case this is. This occurred on August 26, 1966. This is in Punta Carnero, Spain. And I like this case for a number of reasons. The main witness is a medical doctor, and he had a very close encounter with a very unusual humanoid, but apparently was able to get an incredibly clear photograph of this UFO. So that alone makes this case quite important. Now this humanoid encounter case comes from researcher Jose Antonio Caravaca. The main witness is a gynecologist, Dr. Juan Jose Rivera. He was 26 years old at the time of his encounter. This is 5 p.m., August 26, 1966. He had decided to take a ride on his motorcycle in the Punta Carnero area. He was planning on taking pictures of the Straits of Gibraltar and also collecting fossils. Now suddenly he became aware that the environment around him was unnaturally silent. There were no insect sounds, no sounds of wind, no sounds of the waves from the nearby ocean, no rustling of branches, nothing. And he had a very distinct feeling that something unusual was about to happen. And he was right, because immediately he was shocked to see what he first thought was a monkey crossing the road in front of him. But it clearly wasn't a monkey, as it appeared to be floating, and it was dressed in a skin-tight jumpsuit of some kind. It was dark in color, about 4 feet tall. It had a bulging head, he said, a small chin. Its face was pretty much human-like, but had very large, round, black eyes. This figure had very long arms, which it held rigid and unmoving against its body as it made these weird floating leaps across the road. He said these arms almost reached the ground. He did see what looked like wristbands and ankle bands on its arms and legs. So he watched this figure disappear into the brush on the side of the road. He immediately jumped off of his motorcycle, leaned it up against a tree, and chased this being. And boy, was he shocked when he followed it to this clearing where he saw an object landed about 60 feet away. He said it was roughly saucer or oval shaped, 45 to 50 feet long. It had two sort of fin-like protuberances on the back side of it. He said he saw a doorway, what looked like a clear glass-like dome on top of it. And I'll just quote him directly. As Juan says, it was there, in a small valley, where there was a piece of land cleared of trees and undergrowth. It was metallic, matte grayish in color, and at the back, which was the best part, there was a door similar to those in shops, with a shutter closure, the edges standing out. It also had two pointed protrusions at the back, like those on some American cars of the time. At the top of the front, there was a kind of transparent cabin that I think must have been the bridge of command of that device. I cannot be sure if it was resting on the ground or floating a short distance from the ground. Now, Juan was an amateur photographer. He always carried a camera with him. And seeing this strange craft, he immediately pulled his camera up and snapped a quick photograph. And he says it was weird because at that exact moment he felt a, quote, tremendous fear that penetrated him to the bones. So he fled the area in a panic. However, he did later return to search for evidence of it. Couldn't find any evidence of it. This photograph did come out, and researcher Jose Antonio Caravaca says that this is probably one of the best photographs in ufological history. The witness himself regarding the photo says, it looked perfect. It was just a little bit blurry, but you could see that thing perfectly in full color. Keep in mind that whatever it was took up almost the entire slide. Out of fear, and because of my position, I showed it to very few people. So this encounter really had a profound effect on the witness. In fact, he did have some memory problems surrounding the whole event. As the researcher Jose Caravaca says, and I quote, he tells me that he has serious problems remembering everything that happened that afternoon. He has blackouts. He says that this has not happened to him with anything else throughout his life. It is one of those cases that seems to have no explanation, that persists even after years. These are events that have remained latent in the history of ufology in our country, and we could consider that it is probably one of the most important ufological incidents that have taken place in our geography. So the witness has agreed to very few interviews. He kept quiet about the incident for many years, but as he says, I have no idea what it could have been. I have no answers, and I have thought about it a lot. That this was not from this world. I am sure of that. Look, the first strange thing that happened was that silence. You couldn't hear the cicadas in the field, or the wind. Nothing. That was very strange. And look, suddenly that thing appeared about 2 meters away. I can't forget it. It's in my head, and I remember it as if it were yesterday. Now later he would have some other sightings of UFOs, but nothing compared to his encounter with that strange humanoid and the landed craft. What a fascinating and unique case that is, with this doctor having such a close interaction, running up to this landed UFO, apparently getting a photograph of it. It's very well researched, and like many witnesses, he kept it secret for quite some time. To me, that always argues for the authenticity or the credibility of a case, because these are not people who are seeking attention by any means. I mean, this doctor refused most interviews, doesn't want to talk about it. They're not making any financial gain from it. And there's so many cases like these. So yeah, an important and certainly really interesting case. And now we move to another case, which I call the humanoids outside the window. This occurred on January 29, 1967 in Knox City, Missouri, the show me state. And yes, the UFOs definitely showed up. I like this case for a number of reasons. It's got multiple witnesses. It was thoroughly researched. There are landing traces as well. It's a very close-up encounter and a really fascinating described UFO and humanoids as well. This very interesting case comes from esteemed researcher Ted Phillips. He's considered the leading expert in UFO landing traces, and he did include this case in his book, Physical Traces Associated with UFO Sightings. It was around 10 p.m. on the evening of January 29, 1967, as Enid Campbell sat in her home outside of the very small town of Knox City, Missouri. Looking out the window, she saw this bright object, which she thought for a brief moment was the full moon. But as it moved closer, she realized it was something quite different. It was a spherical-shaped craft of some kind. It was white in color, reminding her kind of a semi-transparent frosted light bulb. And it had this shiny gold-colored horizontal ring around the center, which had numerous little holes in it. She said it was quite large, about, quote, 2 stories high, so about as big as a house, and she said it was totally silent. She watched in absolute amazement as it approached to within several feet of her window, right over her backyard, and then came to a stop just above ground level. And inside, through this semi-transparent surface, she saw something amazing. 2 occupants who were wearing, quote, shiny silvery wetsuits. She could see one sitting in front of what she said looked like a control panel of some kind with a lever on top. The other appeared to be standing. So Enid immediately called out to her 2 teenage sons, Jean, age 18, and George, age 14. They both ran up to the window just in time to see this object rise up and start to move away. And as it did so, all 3 of them saw 2 smaller luminous spheres approach the larger object and enter through an opening near the lower ledge. So apparently it was there to examine something, hard to say for sure, but the object then emitted what looked to them like jets of red fire out of these little holes lining the gold-colored band around the circumference. The object then ascended vertically and moved off into the distance and was gone. Now, later the next day, it was discovered that the snow on the ground beneath the area where the object had hovered was completely melted. And also, the pathway that the object had taken as it approached the house. This area failed to grow any plants, whereas elsewhere, all the plants continued to grow normally. So some pretty good landing traces. There you go, another case that's really hard to deny. I mean, when you have 3 witnesses and there's landing traces and they see an object in humanoids that close, I mean right in their backyard, there's no real chance of misperception in cases like these. Thoroughly researched, and I mean, it's just amazing to me that we still have skeptics. Because if you can, disregard 1 case or 2, but we've got thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these cases occurring all over the world. To ignore them would be purely unscientific. And here's another case, which is really quite compelling, not very well known. I call this one UFO and Humanoids Land by a Train. This is another multiple witness case. This occurred on April 20, 1967, near Castellano, Argentina. And it's a pretty fascinating case in terms of the shape of the UFO and the tiny little humanoids that were surrounding it. The witnesses in this next case are several railway workers. It was around 3:30 p.m. on April 20, 1967 that they had a very close encounter with an apparent landed UFO and humanoids. They were traveling by train. They had just passed the Castellano station in Argentina and were heading in the direction of the Galvez station. One of the witnesses, the main witness, his name is Enrique R. Galimberti. He's an engineer. He noticed what he first thought was a house on fire off the side of the tracks. So he immediately slowed down his train just in case assistance was needed, as the train did carry fire extinguishers. But as he got closer, he realized no, this was not a house on fire. Instead, it was something much stranger. It looked like an object covered with brilliant multicolored lights. As Enrique says, I stopped the train to carefully watch what was happening there. With my companion, Mr. Enrique Curto, we could see at a distance of approximately 120 meters something we could not define. But yes, we observed calmly without losing detail. It was a metal apparatus, square-shaped, about 3 meters square, as high, with a number of windows in 3 rows all around it. So it was quite odd looking. They couldn't quite identify it. This object had what looked kind of like a spinning wheel in front, which was filled with colored lights. The craft itself was sending down beams of light to the ground, but most amazing, all around the craft they saw very small beings, very small, maybe about 2 feet in height, Enrique estimates. They were wearing gray uniforms, did not appear to have anything on their heads. They were carrying what Enrique assumed was some kind of weapon on their shoulders, but he couldn't see clearly enough to tell for sure. The other witness, Enrique Curto, was also struck by the strangeness of the object. He says he never saw anything like it, and he did verify that there were figures. As he says, I saw a light and people moving around it, 3 or 4, as human beings with 2 legs and 2 normal arms. A bit hasty movements. Now, he wasn't sure what they were looking at. He said it looked kind of like a box on fire. But as he says, all I saw was the backlight and moving people. He hesitates to call this an actual landed UFO and extraterrestrials. He's a bit more conservative in his interpretation of what happened than Enrique Galimberti, but definitely verifies the whole incident. At this point, Enrique Galimberti decided to blow the train's whistle to see if he could elicit any response from these beings, but when he did, there was no response. Now, they found out something interesting, because Enrique talked to the crew of a train that had passed this location about 50 minutes earlier, and he learned that they had also seen this same craft in the same position. One of the train crew members was Salvador Pomidoro. He was on the earlier train, and he says that he saw, quote, a reddish thing, like an oven, burning bricks. Well, it was a freak thing on Earth. I was struck by the color, so red, like a fire. It looked like a square, about 1.5 meters or so. Now, his train was a freight train and moved quite slowly, so they were able to watch this object for about 10 minutes. They did not stop or slow down, and he says he could not see any other detail than this fiery red glow. He did not see any humanoids. So perhaps, I'm speculating here, he saw when it had just landed, and the later train saw the humanoids. Very hard to say for sure, but it is absolutely an unusual incident. I think you'll agree that's a pretty interesting case. Not a whole lot of information to it, but yeah, multiple witnesses. I also like it because it's one of many cases where UFOs seem to be attracted to trains or train tracks or are seen in the vicinity of trains. That alone is kind of interesting. And yeah, each case adds to our knowledge of what's going on here. And now let's move to another super fascinating case, which I call We Did Not Look Back. This occurred on September 30, 1968 in Roncenay, France. It is a multiple witness case involving very unusual humanoids, a rather typical UFO. But I like this case because it sort of demonstrates how a very close UFO encounter can have a profound effect emotionally on a witness. I mean, this encounter really frightened these young witnesses quite badly. It's a very interesting case. This next case was investigated by French researchers Luc Billon and Raoul Fouin, and this appeared in the French language publication Lumière dans la nuit, Lights in the Night. This is a multiple witness case of a landed UFO and humanoids, though the main witness is Guy Lemargue. This was on the night of September 30, 1968. Guy and his friend were out driving a motorcycle in the area of Roncenay, France. This is about 10 kilometers south of Troyes. But they ran out of gas, so they left their motorcycle behind and began to walk to their destination. And it was around 3 a.m. when they were walking down this rural country road and saw this weird, large, reddish, star-like object moving very fast in a horizontal path across the sky ahead of them. It moved off into the distance and they lost sight of it. And they thought that was it. But moments later, coming around a corner in the road, they were surprised to see that this glowing red object had apparently landed in the field ahead of them, not far from the side of the road. They could see it was a pretty large object. It was glowing a bright red-orange, which was highly visible in the dark of the night. It appeared to be resting on landing legs, which were about 1 meter in height. They said it was rounded in shape, glowing very brightly, had many bright portholes or lights around the edge. It wasn't super big, about the height of a car, but maybe 50 feet wide. They did notice that the top dome part was not illuminated. It was clearly unusual, and the 2 young men were very shocked to see 2 very unusual looking figures standing next to it. And I'll just quote Guy directly. As he says, "When we saw that there were characters who moved around the craft, we hid in a ditch, sheltered from their sight by a grass slope. We were watching them from there. They could not see us. They moved rather quickly, with very strong sources of light in their hands. They ran, but at a certain distance from the ground, 50 or 60 centimeters, therefore without touching the ground. These beings were small, hardly more than 1 meter, surely. They ran like us normally, but without touching the ground." So the witnesses were about 150 meters away, less than 500 feet. And these beings were shining these very powerful flashlights back and forth on the ground as if looking for something. But most strange was the way they appeared to float about 2 feet above the ground, sometimes zipping about 300 feet in one quick movement, floating so fast, in fact, that it was hard to track their movements. The beings themselves also appeared to glow with light. Now, suddenly one of the beings started to approach the two witnesses, and the boys were now close enough that they could see the hands of these beings, which also looked quite unusual. According to Guy, they looked more like two pincers rather than fingers. They could not distinguish any facial features. But as this one figure continued to approach them, it came as close as 15 feet, and the boys believed that their presence had been detected. So they quickly jumped up and ran away in complete panic. As Guy says, "We ran away, very frightened, terrified. We did not look back." So having left the scene without looking back, they do not know how the beings or the craft departed. But some years later, 3 years later, on December 5, 1971, again around 3 a.m. in the morning, Guy had another sighting. He was with two friends driving near Mount Erie, France, when they all saw this weird glowing object coming in for what looked like a landing about 200 feet from the road. It was covered with lights, and Guy, remembering his previous encounter and how frightened it had made him, he got scared all over again, and he was afraid that this object would follow them, so he accelerated quickly past it. But as he did, he could see that it was hovering only about 15, maybe 20 feet above the ground. It was bell-shaped, he said. It had a dark band around the top, and that's it. He couldn't take it, he was too scared, and left the area as fast as he could. I've said it before, but it bears repeating. UFOs are seen everywhere. And this has been going on for a very, very long time. There are so many cases. There's little doubt, certainly in my own mind, that we are being visited by extraterrestrials. How else can you explain all of these cases? Because here's another one. And this one also exhibits some of the same behavior we see over and over again. Which is why I gave it the title, Rock Collecting Aliens. This occurred in 1976 in San Goncalo de Amarante in Brazil. Brazil has a huge number of cases. The Brazilian government's been quite a bit more forthcoming than a lot of governments on our planet, which I also find very interesting. I think that is due to the high levels of activity. And this is another case where a witness came upon a landed UFO, very strange humanoids, and they appeared to be collecting samples. We see a lot of cases like this. This points towards the idea that ETs are here doing all kinds of scientific studies. It's also a really interesting case because there's some landing trace evidence. This case comes from researcher Bob Pratt, who personally interviewed the witness. It was just before dusk one evening in 1976 as 9-year-old Hercílio da Costa was walking to her home in São Goncalo do Amarante, this is in Ceará, Brazil, after attending catechism class. She was walking through a patch of woods, this is a rural area, when she noticed a strange light ahead of her. Moments later, she came upon a craft sitting on 3 legs in a dry riverbed. This craft was round, she said, silver in color. It had a little door, 2 little round windows covered with dark glass. She also noticed 2 red lights on the craft, and the craft itself was making a very loud noise, which was somewhat like a helicopter, but definitely not a helicopter. There were no propellers of any kind. And standing around this craft were 7 men, quite tall, each about 6 feet tall. They were all wearing dark bodysuits. One, she said, was kneeling down and appeared to be putting small pebbles into a transparent bag. And I'll just let Hercilio describe what happened next. As she says, the men looked like Americans. They had normal mouths, hands, no hair. I didn't see the hair as it was covered by their clothes. I didn't see their eyes. They were wearing black boots that came to mid-calf. The man who spoke to me opened his mouth when he spoke. They didn't try to catch me. I was so afraid that I felt chest pains. I ran back to the village and told some men who went back there. So yeah, one of these figures did speak audibly to her in some sort of strange language where she was not able to understand or identify. And even though nothing happened to her, she was very badly frightened. She fled the scene, told the adults what she saw, and they returned to the site no more than 10 minutes after it happened. But the craft was gone, so were the humanoids. But they did find footprints, and they also found 3 squarish holes in the ground, apparently where the landing legs of this craft had depressed into the soil. Yes, that is a single witness case, and yes, the witness was a child, but with the landing traces, it's clear something very unusual happened there. And again, it fits the pattern we see in so many cases where these craft land, ETs come out, they bring out their little shovels or start picking plant samples or taking soil samples or what have you. So it certainly fits the pattern we see in so many cases. As does this next case, which I call the floating humanoid. A lot of cases of these ETs kind of just levitating and floating around, and that's why I want to include this case, because it's a typical example of this. I also found it interesting the way the ET was dressed in a very skin-tight suit, so tight that the witness initially thought that this humanoid was not wearing any clothes at all, but decided that he was, in fact, wearing clothes. This one occurred on December 30, 1979, near Sicily, Italy. And it's a somewhat brief case, but this gentleman saw this ET very close up, and it's just an unusual case overall that I think you'll find quite interesting. This next case is quite brief, but certainly very interesting. It was 1:30 a.m., again on December 30, 1979, when electrician Sebastiano Panettiere woke up because the lights in the house were flashing on and off, and the dog in the attic was growling strangely. In the room with him were his wife and infant daughter, both who remained asleep. But, looking outside his window, Sebastiano saw a brilliant globe of light, and what appeared to be a silhouette of a being suspended inside it. It looked to him like this entity was trying to spy on them through the bedroom window. So he did not have perfect vision. He quickly grabbed his eyeglasses, and now he could see clearly that there was in fact a being of some kind in this globe of light. And he approached the window to get a closer look at this being, and could in fact see that it was a humanoid of some kind, very short, about 3 feet tall, was dressed in a skin-tight white suit that was so tight for a second he thought that this figure was naked. But he could now see that this being was wearing a jumpsuit of some kind, so tight he could see the being's musculature. He said it also wore a tight white hood on its head, and the being was in side profile but quickly turned facing its back to the witness. So Sebastiano never got a good look at its face, but looking at the back of this figure, he saw that there was a thin black stripe which led from its left shoulder to its right waist. He also noticed something else strange. On the back of this suit, there were several prominent black dots on it. Now he could not see the being's forearms, but he could see the being's elbows at its side. He noticed that the being's torso looked slightly swollen, as if the suit was partially filled with air on the sides, though otherwise it was very close-fitting. And another weird thing was the way this figure moved. It started to move away from the window in small jerks,
just a few inches at a time. It covered about 10 to 15 feet in the space of about 5 minutes, which is a pretty long time. And it wasn't walking, but was rather floating at a slight angle. Finally, with a sudden burst of very quick movement, it glided away and disappeared behind a wall, and it was gone.
To me, that's the kind of case that raises all kinds of questions. What the heck is this humanoid doing outside of this guy's house? Because it did not come inside, he didn't see any craft. What's it doing? Is it contacting somebody else? Is it taking samples? Is it just there to visit? Is this sort of a display to let this witness know that ETs are real? Why did it not look at him? It seemed to just completely ignore him. All of these cases raise so many questions. It's again one of the reasons I do this research. There's clearly still a lot to learn about what's going on here. And now we move to another case, which is really interesting. It's another multiple witness case. People seeing a UFO and humanoids pretty darn close up. I call this one Two Aliens Above 2nd Street. This occurred on May 25, 2012 in Clinton, Missouri. Another show me state encounter. And yeah, it's really interesting because this UFO is seen in a place that's pretty darn populated. What would a UFO be doing hovering right over a traffic intersection? Hard to say for sure, but I like this case because, yeah, they got a very close-up look at this craft with humanoids inside of it. It wasn't, as far as I know, professionally researched, but the first-hand eyewitness testimony is quite compelling indeed.
This very interesting multiple witness encounter is fairly recent, and it was reported to the UFO Casebook by one of the witnesses. The witnesses are anonymous, and again, it has not been formally investigated, but it's certainly a compelling first-hand eyewitness account, and I'll just quote the witness directly. And she says, 6 of us were leaving a restaurant and traveling in 2 cars. We headed to drop off some of our party. We were driving west on Highway 7. And as we approached the stoplight at 2nd Street, all of us, 4 of us in my car and 2 in another car in front of us, all saw a craft of some type in the sky just below the clouds. It had 4 rectangular windows in it. The car in front of us saw it first and got a better view of the object. The 2 people in the car in front of us said that they saw thin, humanoid-type beings standing in 2 of the windows, which emitted a yellowish glow from inside the craft. No one in my car saw the beings, but we did clearly see the windows and saw the craft back up, move down a bit, then move up into the clouds. There were no lights on the outside of the craft, and it was so dark that it was difficult to see the shape of it, so all we could clearly see were the 4 horizontal windows with a light inside of them. Our friends in the first vehicle were so shaken by this that they refused to talk about it anymore. I'm reporting this because I think you should know about the incident. Surely other people saw it as well. I just can't believe it. We are all very practical people, and no one has seen a UFO before. But I believe that was exactly what we saw. Since that night, I've been seeing some strange, big white and amber lights in the sky that look like they have webs over them and pulse different colors. I've never seen those before either. I would like to know what is going on.
So there you go. It's another case that raises all kinds of questions. It is what we would term basically a close encounter of the first kind, a simple sighting, but there were humanoids, so I guess you would call that a close encounter of the third kind. I'm not so sure how effective some of these classifications are, because people can have a sighting and have telepathic communication. How would you classify that? So there, again, is still so much to learn. I suspect that sighting may have involved someone else being taken on board. Said it before, one person's sighting is another person's onboard experience. But pure speculation, hard to say for sure. But it's one more case out of so many that makes it very clear we are not alone on this planet, that we are being visited. And to ignore all these cases and say they're not true or they're the result of hoaxes, hallucinations, misperceptions, and mental illness simply doesn't hold water. There are far too many, so many witnesses of very high credibility. I mean, that case involving Chester Grusinski and the FDR aircraft carrier, I mean, that's undeniable. You can say that some of these witnesses are lying, but when you have that many Navy officers seeing all this kind of stuff, don't think that the hoax explanation holds any water whatsoever. But I am just putting forth the facts as we know them. You can make up your own minds about it. I really want to thank you for watching. I think this is a very important subject, so I really appreciate it. We all deserve to know the truth. It's time for this cover-up to end, and I hope one day it does. Frankly, I don't think our governments will ever willingly disclose, but truth has a way of taking care of itself, so we will see. So thanks once again, and until next time, keep searching for the truth, keep asking those hard questions, and most important of all, keep having fun. I'll see you next Friday. Bye, guys.